Hello everyone, this is Salar and you're watching Smart Code. I bring to you another interesting JavaScript project, and this project is about scripting and validating HTML form. The JavaScript is a great tool for client-side form scripting and validation. For example, you can use regular expressions to allow only desired patterns, or you can check for required fields. On popular websites, when you try to log in or register yourself, you get immediate feedback in case you leave any required field empty. And sometimes you are asked to enter data in a specific format. For example, the phone number. This is basically called client-side form validation. It is an important feature of good user experience because you let the user to fix the problem straight away. Now imagine what will happen if there is no initial client-side validation. Data is sent to the server and it is then rejected by the server. So there will be a significant amount of delay caused by a round trip to the server and then back to the client side to tell the user to fix the data, right? So the client side validation is important. Like I said, it improves user experience. So we are going to do the same. We will program a client-side validation with the help of JavaScript. Our application is join email list that you see on the screen. And you definitely have seen such applications on the web, right? Our application is simple, but the script we are going to write is genuine. And you can use that script for other applications such as registration or contact form. We are going to program two different features. Feature number one is all the fields are required. That means a user can't leave any field empty. In case of any empty field, we will display an appropriate message. And the second feature is provided email addresses must be the same. And if they are not same, then we are going to again inform the user about the problem. But if everything is fine, then we are going to submit the data. And for that, we just call another HTML file. In real applications, we usually call a server-side file which receives the data. So now you have an idea how our application gonna work. So let's jump into the code and start the development. In my VS Code editor, I have four different files. One CS file, one JS file, and two HTML files. Index.html is our main file and join.html is called only when the validation is successful. Right, so we're going to set up HTML in the index file. And you can also say CSS and JS file is already added to the head section of index.html. In the script tag, I'm using defer keyword. And this attribute is important in case where you include JavaScript in the head section. And it means the execution of JavaScript can safely be delayed until the entire HTML document is completely rendered. And you can also put a script element to the body section. And so you don't need to use defer attribute, right? But your HTML, which is going to be affected by this JS file, must appear before this script element so that the HTML is completely ready and rendered for the JavaScript, right? So you can load your JavaScript in the head section or in the body. The choice is yours. Let's now set up HTML. I'm going to take a container for the entire application. The first element in the container is the header, and in the header I will put the title. And so now we need HTML form, so let's code it, right? And the form action is join.html, and the form method is get. You can also use post if you want, but it doesn't make any difference because we are not sending data to the server. Now this form needs an ID so that we can access it from the JavaScript. And so now in the form, I'm going to define three sections using div element. One section for email, one for re-enter email, and one for name. Right, so now we have three sections and each section consists of three elements: label, input, and span. So let me first code the first section and then we will talk about it. right? So this is how a single section looks like. A label, a text box, and a span tag. And you can notice input element and the span tag have their respective IDs because we need them in the JavaScript. And the text in the span tag is an asterisk and it means the field is required. And if something wrong happens, we are going to change this asterisk with an error message. And for other sections, I'm going to copy and paste these three elements and then I will change the attributes accordingly. Right, so all the sections are now ready and you can see them in the browser. And here we have them: email section, re-enter email section, and name section. And lastly, we are going to code a submit button. Right, so our HTML is now ready. When the input type is submit, you get a button in the browser. And this button is a special one because it fires the submit event whenever you click on it. And here you need to remember one thing: the submit event fires on the form element, not on the button. Right? So this button is just a tool that invokes the event, but the actual event is fired on the form. So why I am telling you all this? Because we are going to control this event in the JavaScript and it will only be fired when the form is validated according to our requirements. And form submission simply means this action becomes activated and join.html file is called, and in that file we only have a message that says thanks for joining our email list. And the same CSS file is included here as well. So the style that we are going to apply to the header element in the index file will automatically be applied here, right? So our HTML is ready and it's now time to put some CSS. In the CSS, first we are going to select the program container, which is a main element, and we'll set width, border, and padding. And so now we are going to put the entire container to the center of the page using margin 0 auto, right? So our application is now center aligned, as you can see here. Let's now style the header, give it a color and some bottom margin. Now I will choose all the span tags and set the color to the red. And so now I'm going to make this section look nicer. Let's target the label element and apply some properties. And so finally, we are going to put some gaps between the text boxes and between the labels and the text boxes. So let's do that. So that was the CSS part, and here we have the final look of our application. And you can have more CSS if you want, but as you know, in my JS tutorials, I usually write basic CSS so that we can put more focus on the JavaScript. Let's now jump into the final round where we write some interesting JavaScript. Now, before we start validating the text boxes, we need to prepare some resources. So first, we are going to write a function that returns an element by its ID. We are going to use getElementById function on several places in the code. So instead of calling getElementById again and again, we can write a function, and that function is going to return us the element by its ID. So let's code the function. Right, so whenever we need an element in the JavaScript, we are gonna call this function and pass the ID to it, right? Now, another thing that we can do here, which is related to the user experience, is that we can put cursor in the first text box as the window is loaded. So let's program it. Now I will call the function we just coded and pass the ID of the first text box to it. And then we will say put focus to the text box. Let's now check in the browser if we get focus in the first text box or not. We need to load the window, and here you see our first text box is getting focus. Now, one last thing that we need to program before the validation is the deactivation of submit event. The submit event is coded behind this button and it is activated. When you click on it, the event is fired on the form and the form is submitted without any validation. Let's see what will happen. Our form is empty now, and when I make a click on the button, the form is now submitted with the empty values, right? So we don't want this behavior. What we want is in real applications, we stop or cancel the submit event and perform first validation. And we fire the event only when the validation is successful, right? So now in the JavaScript, we are going to cancel the submit event on the form. So we are going to get the form first using its ID. And so now we are going to listen for the event on the form, and we are only interested in submit event. So in the JavaScript, we are actively listening whenever the submit event is fired on the form. And in order to take an appropriate action, we need to call a function to execute some JavaScript. So let's do that. Right, so here is a function we are calling. It is sometimes called anonymous function or event handler. The most important thing here is the argument which is automatically passed to this function. I named it event info, but you can have whatever name you like. For example, you can name it just as event, or you can name it just as a single character A, right? So the name doesn't matter. The thing that matters most here is that what does it do? So this parameter is actually called event object and it is passed automatically to the function associated with an event. So the function that we have here is associated with this submit event, right? Now the question is, what does this argument do? Like I said earlier, it is an event object. It represents the submit event. Or in other words, you may say this argument itself is the submit event. We are listening for the submit event in the JavaScript, and at the same time, we are getting the event in the JavaScript using the event object, right? So this event object is actually the submit event. And when we have it in a JavaScript, we can deactivate its functionality just by calling prevent default method on it, right? So this prevent default function or method is gonna cancel the event. So now we are good. Let's now refresh the page and see if it is working or not. And now here you see the submit event is deactivated or cancelled, right? Now we are good to perform validation, and validation is straightforward. So we are gonna validate whenever the click is made on the button. So let's get the button in the program and apply add event listener to it to listen for the click event. Right, validation is a function that we're gonna call. So let's code this function. In the functions, we are gonna first read all the values from the text boxes in different variables. So here we have all the values, and one more thing that we can do while reading the values is that we can call trim on them to remove all the extra white spaces. Now we need a boolean variable to keep track of validation process, and this variable is set to true from the beginning. And if something goes wrong, we are going to set it to false. And in the last, we will read this variable to determine if the process was successful or not, right? So let's now validate the first email and see if it is provided or not. So if the first email is an empty string, we are going to get the span tag and set the error. And at the same time, we are going to set is valid to false. And if everything is good, we are going to put the asterisk back into the span tag. Right, so our first input field is now validated. Let's now check it out in the browser to see if it is working or not. So the field is empty, and when I click on the button, error message is shown, right? And when I provide something here, like an email address, and click on the button, then it is gone, right? So the first field is validated. Now we are going to validate the other two. Now the second email must be the same as the first one, so we can write an if statement like this. So if the email addresses are not same, we are going to put again an error message in the span tag. And we're going to set is valid to false. And in case when everything is fine, we're going to put asterisk back to the span tag. Right, so we have validated both the email addresses. And in the last, we will look if the name is provided or not. So if the name field is empty, we are going to set the error. And we'll set is valid to false. And when the name is provided, we are going to put asterisk back to the span tag. Right, so all the fields are validated. Let's now check the development in the browser. So when you click on the button with empty fields, you will see the error messages, and the message is gonna disappear when you provide data to the text boxes. Right? So it's now time to submit the form because the validation is completed. We have a variable which is tracking the process. And so now we are going to use that variable for the form submission. So in an if statement, we are going to read is valid variable. If the value in this variable is true, that means everything went fine and we are good to submit the form. So we are going to access our form again, and on the form we will simply call submit method. This submit method submits the form just like submit event, right? So now our form validation application is ready. So let's now give it a final run. So all the required fields are provided. There is no error in the data. So let's click on the button. And here you see the form is submitted successfully. So that was a simple tutorial on form validation, and I hope you like this one. I will see you around, and don't forget to give me feedback just by leaving comments under this video. Thanks for watching this video.